and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 22nd episode in our ongoing series. Our June installment was recorded in an unusual location, as several IGS trustees traveled to the city of Gold Coast in Australia for the annual conference of the International Communication Association. The podcast was recorded at a local radio station and features Lance Strate, Thom Gencarelli, and Laura Trujillo-Liñán in conversation with Australian media personality and researcher Renée Peterson. Renée has spent over 2 decades as a media industry professional in Australia and the US, as a radio and television producer, writer, and on-air broadcaster, and is currently completing her doctoral degree at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Their conversation centers on the role of radio and newer forms of digital media in Australia, the United States, and Mexico, and on more recent developments in digital media. And they also talk about language, dialects, and not surprisingly, general semantics. Let's listen in.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Lance Strate, and I'm here with my fellow trustees, Laura Trujillo-Liñán and Thom Gencarelli, and we're coming to you from an unusual place. We are down under in the land of Oz in Australia in a place called Gold Coast. We're here for the International Communication Association's annual meeting, and we're here with a special guest and someone that we will be talking to and is also producing this at the same time, Renée Peterson. Welcome, Renée, or you should say welcome to us, I guess.
Absolutely. Welcome to Australia. It's an honour to have you in our country, and especially on the Gold Coast, Queensland, Australia, which is the town that I was born in, and also the radio station that we're recording the podcast in at the moment is with a company called Southern Cross Oz Stereo. They're one of the largest media companies in Australia. It's like iHeartMedia in the US. And the station that I started my radio career on is where we are right now, 90.9 CFM. So this is a very full circle moment. So thank you so much for coming in. This is exciting.
Well, it's great to be here, and just to tell our listeners, we are going at this very professionally this time as we're sitting in a radio station studio.
Yeah, you are. Does it feel good versus Zoom?
Absolutely.
What about you, Laura? Have you ever been in a radio station before?
Well, no. Once I was in Universidad Panamericana. We recorded a podcast, but never been in a radio station.
Well, it's definitely made a professional transition from when I started radio when I was 20, way back, where we actually used to, yes, it was digital, but we actually used to put the CDs in the cart to play the music. So I used to do a top 30 show, much like Ryan Seacrest, how he does American Top 40. And we would actually play the hottest 30 songs Monday to Friday. And it used to be networked or syndicated, as you say in the US, across Australia. So we have definitely come a long way since that moment.
Lance, you and I go back far enough to remember Casey Kasem doing American Top 40.
Oh,
right?
yes.
Oh,
I used to listen to that every week.
Oh, I love that. Thom, that's so cool. Obviously, Rick Dees, and when he did American Top 40, I actually got to meet Rick Dees when I was in America, and that was a incredible moment because I used to listen to him when I was like 12 on the radio. So, I mean, coming from America, like obviously you mentioned him, is there another, radio personality or station that you love and that you listen to?
New York market has, I think, between AM and FM, about 95 different stations. We don't, it's kind of a predictable and conservative market because it's so big and so much money is at stake, right? So in terms of really being into music, we have Lance's university has what is really not a college station, but a public station called WFUV, Fordham University's Voice. And I think that's the best place to listen in New York.
And we had a lot of the DJs that I remember listening to growing up on was it NEW?
Yeah, WNEW FM, 102.7.
They were, Dennis Elsis, would be one of them.
Pete Fornatel,
who passed away. They were the folks who kind of right at the start of album-oriented rock.
That's right, yeah.
And one who didn't make it, passed away too early, Ellison Steele, the Nightbird.
That's right. And didn't Vince Scelsa have a weekly show on WFUV2 for a while?
I think so, yeah.
I mean, look, American radio, I've been so lucky to work in America as the entertainment reporter for Southern Cross Stereo, where we are right now. And so I used to do all the red carpets. I'd come to New York. I'd interview Mark Wahlberg, you name it, Scarlett Johansson or Matt Damon. And I would produce content from that side of the country in New York and Los Angeles. And then the content that I would produce would come back to this radio station and then be distributed across Australia. But if you're looking at like radio, I guess, there's this real, and especially in my research when I talk to celebrities who are, radio announcers or musicians, they're actually gravitating to US college radio to find like new music and new talent. So even though, Howard Stern is one of the most paid and most, I would say, popular, well-known, whether he's well-liked or not, that's probably debatable, radio personalities in the US, it's really interesting how that's sort of changing, the radio landscape changing.
Well, and of course, he took off from terrestrial radio and went to satellite. And it's an interesting story that there was Sirius satellite radio and XM satellite radio. And at one point, they went to the Department of Justice in the United States and they said, can we merge? And the Department of Justice said, well, we're about antitrust. We're not about monopolies. But what would have happened if they hadn't merged was that XM probably would have gone out of business anyway. So they allowed the merger. And Howard is kind of the franchise, So, I mean, if Howard, decides to retire, it's going to be interesting. Will there still be a Sirius XM? Will there still be satellite radio? And of course, so now we've got terrestrial radio, AM and FM. We've got satellite radio, and we've got whatever internet radio is, and streaming media. So it's an interesting environment, interesting landscape.
Yeah, it is very interesting. And I think also if you think about like individually, each of you, how do you listen to the radio? Do you actually have an old school radio like I do? And I also listen on my phone, and I listen in the car. It's like, how do you consume radio as a media?
Yeah. When got a Prius, I guess that was 2012, it got this Sirius satellite radio for the first time and been listening to that ever since. And, another one of the DJs, goes back to early childhood, Cousin Brucey. Oh, and that was like AM radio before, there really was much of an FM, and AM was playing like top 40 hits. And I think he's gone now, but I used to listen to him. There was like a channel for 60s, just for 60s music, and also very nostalgic.
Going all the way back to when AM radio had top 40, that was the time when they played all kinds of music, right? There was no stratification of formats and, certain kind of music for a certain kind of listener. Everybody listened to everything, which was kind of nice, Not like that anymore.
I know, it's so different. And I think, one of the reasons, obviously I've worked in radio for 20 plus years and worked in television. And the one thing I love about radio as a medium and as a media is that it's an instant message to the audience. So you can literally turn on this desk and make it live. And out of this studio, we can go to the whole of Australia, to all those radio stations owned by Southern Cross Stereo. Like, there's nothing like it. Like, obviously, the transition into social media, and you can do that on TikTok or Instagram, but there is nothing like the connection between radio and an audience. And I think that's, with my PhD research, looking at old media, radio, television and print, and then looking at new media and where that kind of sits. And also interested to hear you talk about where you get radio. Like, obviously, you live in the US. For us Aussies, radio in America is like, it's like going to the Oscars. You've got Ryan Seacrest, who I met, who was incredible. You've got Howard Stern, whereas, I mean, how do you feel about those radio personalities? Is it a thing for you, or it's just like, it's just someone on radio?
Well, being of a certain age, I think it is, but I don't think it is for the younger folks. I don't think they listen at all. Yeah,
when we talk to our students about this, they know radio from driving in their parents' cars, but they don't listen at all. And, I started a program and built a whole facility, and we decided not to create a radio production studio. We decided to put all of the money into video production because no one really was paying attention to the future as a possible career path. I guess again, you can go into streaming. There are a lot of our students intern at SiriusXM and intern at Spotify. But yeah, they listen in a completely different way than we grew up and, given a studio like this.
And, to bring a little general semantics into it as far as categories, what category do you put things into? And when I started out teaching, we had a concentration that was broadcasting. And broadcasting was radio, television. They naturally went together because they were both broadcast media. And when we were about 10 years ago, we were kind of refiguring how to do our majors. We were going to break it up into different majors. And the feedback from the students was that they didn't care about radio. I'm sorry to say that. But also that they saw television being going together with film, because we had a separate concentration because it was a separate kind of area of study, separate academic tradition to study film, cinema studies and film theory, but they saw film and television as going together, which says a lot about cable, HBO, and all the kind of cinematic television, quality TV that we get today.
TV,
so we shifted to having a major that's film and TV, and radio is, I'm sorry to say, nowhere in that.
Well, they're listening to streaming services, and that's really interesting because how do you discover new music? And I talked to them about. We have a friend, colleague Doug Rushkoff, who wrote a book, "Program or Be Programmed." And he's not saying, learn to be a coder, but what he's saying is, how do you feel about the fact that you discover new music based upon algorithms that, make comparisons between what you're listening to and what someone else is listening to? And, and again, it's not broadcasting. It's not mass media, mass communication. So where do you get your music from in that world? And I think we still get it from one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And Thom, that's a good point. And going back to what Lance said about radio, because I actually am lecturing radio production in Melbourne at a university, and I love teaching it because I still love radio. I'm so passionate about it. Whether you get it old school way on an actual radio that you have or in your car, or whether you do it on streaming, I say to the students, radio is immediate. It beats streaming and it beats podcasting because it goes live. But the skills that you learn in radio, so editing, audio, scripts, paneling, what I'm doing on this side for you guys, producing, setting it up, all of those skills professionally transition into streaming, podcasting, when you're at university and, they have to create a podcast, whether you want to be an audio producer, which is an interesting point. But it is, you think about, obviously in my research, when I talk to an attributed celebrity, as defined by Dr. Christopher Bell, which is a journalist and a chat show host, and I talk to them about how do you feel about, as a traditional media radio personality, how do you feel about having your radio content, pushed onto social media platforms and streaming? And they say, if we don't do it, we don't exist. And that's kind of where I guess we've got, I don't know about you, Laura, how do you feel about the whole radio, streaming services? Is it something that you gravitate towards or?
Well, I was thinking that maybe the radio is coming back because nowadays many people listen to podcasts, and I think that is like a way before come back to the radio. And now that you were talking about the importance of the streaming and the relationship with the audience. So I think it's really important to be connected with the people through the radio. So I have been thinking about that. And also I don't listen the radio. I like more, sorry, but I
I like your honesty. You're meant to be honest.
Yes.
Why lie about it?
I listen Apple Music or Spotify, but now that I am listening to you, I will come back to listen radio, of course.
I can convince anyone to listen to the radio. I mean, I listen to radio all around the world, and more so, obviously, when I've been looking at media ecology, thanks to Professor Lance, obviously I introduced that into my PhD research. Everything fell into place for me when I discovered media ecology, the study of media as environments. When I look at celebrity and social media influencers, it was like the missing piece to my puzzle in my research. And so I'm so thankful for Lance for, introducing me to that and giving me the time and inviting me to speak, obviously on Zoom and obviously at ICA 2024, because if it wasn't for that, I think I'd be a bit lost.
But I'd like to ask Laura then, about radio in Mexico. And, I was in Mexico the first time in the 70s when I was young. And, it was certainly long past the time that the Beatles had broken up. But the thing that really stuck out for me was on the radio all the time. It was John Paul, Ringo, George. It was always they were always playing the Beatles on radio. But do the young people in your classes listen to radio at all? Or people, is it still a popular medium there?
Yes, now I think it's the same like Thom just said, that young people just listen like playlist and all this music recorded, but they are listening to podcasts. So yes, I think again, the radio is coming back. Yes.
I did want to throw out two names because we were talking about, looking back on things. And I wonder, Renée, if you've heard of them. But one was, and I remember listening to him on the radio because it's not just music, but Gene Shepard.
Oh, yeah.
Who was this incredible storyteller. I actually was able to get some CDs with, recordings of his shows.
Oh, wow. No, I don't know about him. See, this is what I love when we all unite from all different parts of the globe. We get together and it's like, have you heard of this one? Have you heard of this one?
Some of the shows might be on YouTube, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, just unbelievable. Like he would have like an hour. He would tell stories. Some of his stories were made into movies. Like I think Christmas Story.
Yeah.
That movie is based on just his recounting of his childhood. It's always his childhood experiences.
He was on WOR, New York. That's right. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. I'm definitely going to look that one up. I'll be researching that on YouTube.
Yeah. I mean, outstanding. It's just sort of comedic, but,
And it's also, he's a guy, obviously, but Gene, Jean.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
That's very contemporary 2024.
Well,
maybe a little bit earlier than that, but that's cool. That's very cool. Oh, well, I'll definitely add that to my research.
Who's the other one?
The other one's Fire Sign Theater.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know that one either.
And that was, they came out of L.A. Mm-hmm. I'm connected to, there's a couple of them that are still alive. David Osman is the one I'm connected to on Facebook. He actually blurbed my first poetry book, through a friend of a friend. But Fire Sign Theater started in radio. They did comedy, but most comedy recording, it's like someone telling jokes. You've heard it once and that's it. Mm-hmm. But their comedy was like music because they had there were four of them. They were like the Fab Four of comedy. Yeah. And so there would be like multiple layers and things going on. Mm-hmm. And the best known work was the Adventures of Nick Danger.
Oh, wow.
Which was modeled after old radio plays, but just full of these like little jokes and references to Beatles songs and all kinds of things. But it's the most brilliant comedy that's pure audio. They had like one bit, that same album it's on is called How Can You Be in Two Places at Once When You're Not Anywhere at All? And there's a segment where they, through audio, they express the sensation of driving.
Oh, wow.
So that you get voices going and they're reading like what the signs would be, but they would fade in and fade out to give you that sense of movement through space. They were absolutely brilliant. There was nothing like them.
And as a comedy troupe, although it's audio only, they're in a way the American version of Monty Python, who obviously weren't just audio. They were, That was TV, BBC. Yeah.
When I was in college, we used to listen to the Monty Python record albums.
Right.
But they were primarily TV, and so second to Firesign Theatre in terms of what they did with audio, which came out of radio and that playing with production. So they also did like radio commercials and other kinds of radio programs that have come out on albums as well. But then they went into the studio and did this incredible work.
I love that. I'm definitely going to research that. I find it so fascinating, obviously, listening to the three of you talk about, your experiences with radio in your own countries, because obviously Australia, yes, we're about 27 million for the entire country, the population. And, I, have been lucky enough to work in the US, and it's interesting what I gravitate towards. Obviously, Ryan Seacrest, when I met him, he's such an incredible person, when you meet him, but also what he's achieved in radio and how he's syndicated across the country. And then, looking at obviously Howard Stern, that would be a dream to meet Howard Stern just to see how that evolution is. But also like going back, to Rick Dees or Casey
Kasem. Yeah.
That's it. I mean, we got those in Australia. We would be, before social media, it's like, we would occasionally get on the web and see who that was. But now, with the whole professional transition from, old media to new media and all the celebrity and radio people like navigating their contemporary media ecology, it's like, like what we said, we can listen to someone in Mexico or New York or, you can listen to Australia. Would you understand our Australian accent sometimes? Maybe not. Maybe not our humor.
I'm not sure I understand you right now.
It's funny when you bring up Ryan Seacrest. Here's another connection that goes back. He's taken the American Top 40 show, which is rooted. Casey Kasem started that, but he also does on New Year's Eve out of Times Square in Manhattan the whole celebration of the ball dropping and welcome to the new year. And that show that he inherited was. The main celebrity host of it for so many years was a guy named Dick Clark.
Yes.
Now, Dick Clark goes back to radio in Philadelphia in the 1950s, and out of his radio program, they started a local television program called American Bandstand. And then
I remember that.
Yeah, and then American Bandstand, I don't remember if it was network or syndicated, but it went out across the country, and it would be on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of the day for, was it a half an hour or an hour? And this was the place where,
I think half an hour.
Yeah, if you were, an up and comer with a new record coming out, this is what broke you. You got on this show, and they would have an audience of kids who would dance, and then they would rate the record. And I'd give it an 85. It had a good beat, and I could dance to it. It was just, but that was so important in from after Presley leading up to the British invasion, because Presley started, or Presley was important in the growth of contemporary pop music in the United States, but then we stole from the British. The Beatles arrived, and
and then it was all over. And I do know about Dick Clark, obviously, because Ryan Seacrest talks about how important he was for his career. And, I love that you brought up the, celebration of on New Year's Eve into the new year in New York, because I do watch that. And, all these great things, you can be a radio personality, but all of a sudden, you navigate your contemporary media ecology and suddenly you're a social media influencer within your field. And it's, I'm really thankful for technology that we can, share messages globally and connect. I mean, that's how Lance and I met when I introduced media ecology into my PhD research. I just went to the library, old school, found the book Media Ecology that was in hot pink, and I'm like, that's my color. Oh, who's Lance Strate? Okay, let's have a look at him. And I went to LinkedIn and found him on LinkedIn and went, sent him a nice message. And of course he responded. And then all of a sudden, there you go. One message connected us all together.
And Zoom.
And now you're in Australia, in the hometown that I grew up in. It's mind blowing.
Yeah, when you talk about the fate of radio, the one thing that I don't understand, and it could so easily have been done, is to put access to broadcast radio into our mobile devices so that we could just pick them up. And especially if the internet ever went down or why you didn't have Wi-Fi, if you could just pick up radio, because it's like nothing, right? It's a tiny chip that you just would have to add in. There's plenty of room to do that, and you could have regular radio on the smartphone or on any mobile device, and they just don't do that. I think that would have made a big difference.
So you're talking about picking up direct signal, because, for instance, I have the WFUV app, and here we are in Australia, and I can listen to WFUV live.
Right, and that's what you would do over the internet, but not. We're not capable of getting broadcast signals,
right?
And that would have made a big difference if we could get the broadcast signal on our phones.
You know, it's really interesting when obviously we go to the smartphone, iPhone or Samsung, whatever you're into. Maybe you still have an old school BlackBerry. There's Kyle Sandilands, who's the #1 breakfast radio host in Australia. They do the show Kyle and Jackie O. Quite controversial, similar to Howard Stern, but very Australian, very it will shock you. And it goes live on commercial radio, and they're based in Sydney. They've been together for 20 plus years, and they've just gone into the Melbourne market, and radio has become so alive. But it's really interesting, if you delve deeper into how you access radio from around the world. So, for example, Southern Cross Austereo have a listener app, and you download the app and you can listen to any one of their radio stations across Australia. So the only thing is, though, the one thing when I lived in America is I have American iTunes, and I will not give that up because I want the access to what's happening in America. So therefore, I can't download the listener app because it's only for Australian iTunes. Whereas if you listen to iHeartMedia or maybe, Tom, the app that you were talking about, that station, I could probably download it. So I think that's a really interesting point, that there's still control with the media and where they're allowing their messages to be distributed. Obviously, that comes down to, commercial radio and advertising and sponsors, whereas it's different for social media platforms because there's really no control. You can,
I mean, I think when you talk about, what is internet radio, is there internet radio? Really what it is, at least in the United States, is, I forget how many stations there are, AM and FM across the country, about 1,500 maybe. No, it's more than that. But anyway, what they all did originally was they repositioned their broadcast signal onto the internet. So, because they said, well, where is this going? Well, we have to be there. We have to hedge our bets and we have to make sure that we're competing into the future. And so they've all done this, right? And so it's just a different means of delivery.
And there are the interactions. I mean, telephone made a big difference, and that gave us the call-in show. And then, for a while, radio on television. So you probably remember, Tom, I mean, back in the day, and with MSNBC, their morning show used to be a video version or just a camera set up for Imus in the morning.
Yeah.
And they would just show us what was being broadcast. Not that these folks were all that good looking or interesting visually, but they didn't have any other morning programming until Imus wound up making a comment that, he was sort of before Howard Stern and kind of Howard Stern's model as a shock jock, but he made a comment that came across as racist, that, like a year or two earlier, would have been par for the course for that sort of thing. And it just hit at the wrong time. And that was the end of his career. Yeah.
It's interesting how that happens. All of a sudden your career's over, yet you can be like Howard Stern and be so controversial. I mean, I remember watching Howard Stern probably 15 years ago when it was, he would have people in the studio that were controversial and doing all this kind of stuff. And I've really seen, Howard Stern do this, professional transition in his radio career to, obviously have, the social media that he provides is unbelievable in alignment with his radio show. But it's kind of like more of a different kind of vibe these days. I don't know. Do you think he's matured, or do you think they've told him you can't, bring the dancers into the studio anymore and do all that crazy stuff?
Well, I don't know if mature is the word that I would use, but certainly he's become, and this is with his audience in satellite radio, right? So he's become a go-to interviewer that all of these figures from music, and of course a lot of them are older figures, kind of God, we're dating ourselves in this program. From, Lance and my day in terms of, popular music and the people who are still, going out on tour and still making records, even though they're hitting their 70s and 80s. They're all going to his show to be interviewed by him because he's considered really a go-to interviewer. It's an interesting story. His transition to satellite radio. I mean, I'll just say the short part of it was that, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, was fining him and his show and his syndicator for all of these transgressions. And he said, if we go to satellite radio, they can't touch us anymore because they don't regulate satellite. And so then the show changed and he could, say words that he wasn't able to say on broadcast radio because they'd get fined and such. But then, there was this shift that he's suddenly, I don't know, he's gained some gravitas.
Yeah, it's, I love Howard Stern's interviews, and I use examples of his interviews with a lot of students that I tutor and lecture at university because he listens. And I think that's a really key point, is that you can interview anyone and we can chat and do a podcast. But the key is listening. And also Howard Stern is really great at making Bruce Springsteen the star of the show, even though Howard Stern is like the number one paid radio station host in the world. He can bring Pink in and he can get Pink to talk about her family, and then all of a sudden she's so vulnerable and real, and you just relate to the audience. Like, even, there could be a mum in the car listening to it and all of a sudden they're like, oh, I feel you, Pink, being a mum's hard. Or he can talk to someone like Billie Eilish and he can, take her back to when she started in her bedroom making music with her brother, or Taylor Swift or the Rolling Stones, whoever it might be. So he has this real amazing talent at connecting the audience with the message he's trying to get out of the celebrity or the host, and maybe a bit of maturity. Maybe he just shifted his direction, I guess.
And nothing left to prove.
No. Yeah. I think he's worth something like $46 million. His net worth.
Well, Laura, is there someone like that in Mexico?
Do you have shock jocks in Mexico?
Yes, that's what I want to know. What's Mexican radio like?
Well, I don't listen too much radio in Mexico, but what I know is that people don't want to be involved in many things in Mexico. So everything, I think, it's like political. So it's very difficult for us to have bad news in television and in the radio. So I think the people prefer to listen to music, and that's it. And I have asked my students about, what do you hear? What do you like? And they say that they watch YouTube, for example, and they listen a lot of podcasts. So that is amazing for me because, I didn't know that they were so attached to this kind of media. But yes, in Mexico, it's everything about politics and yes, I don't know, bad news and all these things. So
wait. So we've been down to visit you a number of times, Lance and I, and we've driven in Mexico City traffic, and so people going to work in the morning, they don't have this practice of guys and women on the air making jokes and trying to make, I'm starting my day and it's Monday morning. And so let's do some happy talk and, make fun of things. Mexico has none of that?
In the radio?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also about generations.
Okay.
Because I know that, for example, my husband loved to listen the radio.
Oh, he's still old school. I love that.
Yes.
He's right here, but not on mic.
But I don't like radio, so just I turn off the radio and play my music. But I think it's generational.
So when you drive together, you get to choose, not him.
Yes, of course, Lance.
Yes, happy wife, happy life. You say that in the US, right?
Yes, we do.
Laura, can I ask you, I'm really curious about, obviously, when you talk to your students about what they listen to, so radio, podcasting and streaming. And I ask my students this in Australia because the way that I grew up, it was old media. My mum would buy the newspaper and my mum said, you always have to be over general knowledge about the city that you live in, and be able to, have a conversation, whether it's about politics, a celebrity, what's happening locally in the community. We would always listen to the radio. I have so many amazing memories of my mum with the radio on and, Fleetwood Mac, and I got to meet Stevie Nicks, and that was like a dream come true. And all these where as, growing up, this is how I connected. And like we sort of had the discussion before, it's parents that are making their children or adult children listen to the radio. But my question is for Mexico, especially because you were talking about, the bad news that's on the radio and, where do your students go to get immediate news about what's happening in their country or in their town? Like, how do they source it?
Well, they go to Instagram or TikTok or YouTube. They listen to the influencers. I don't know if the word in English is correct.
Influencers? Yeah,
yes,
that's correct.
So they listen to them and they choose who people to follow. And that is the information they have. Yes.
Okay. And that's interesting. And just an extension on that question is obviously in Australia, we obviously for commercial radio and television, we're bound by regulations and laws. Obviously, Howard Stern clearly could not be on one of our stations here because it's free to air. But does that, obviously, are they worried about the news that they're getting on social media platforms, whether it's correct or whether it's propaganda or what, is it true? Is the message true or is it made up? Like, what is it? Are they concerned about that?
Well, I think they think that they are very clever and they won't be fooled by the social media. So I have tell them that they have to be careful about the news and to be critical and reflect about what they are listening. But I think the young people wants to follow this kind of people in social media, and they want to believe that what they listen or see is true.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to hear that obviously, and the same with my students that I teach is that, obviously in Australia, we have commercial radio and you've got SBS and ABC, which are more, news-driven international messages, a lot about politics and our Prime Minister and stuff like that. And then you come to a station where we are here at 90.9 CFM and it's all about the music. It's like Kiss FM in LA or Z100 in the US. It's, we're bound by these laws and, with the transition of radio going into new media, so social media platforms, the information and the content they produce, they distribute across social media platforms and it has to be in alignment, obviously, with the rules and regulations of Australia. But in Mexico, it clearly doesn't, right? It just sort of, they'll go to influencers like what you said and just get their new, how do they know that is that influencer a newsreader or a radio personality or are they just someone on going, oh, this is what's happening in Mexico?
Well, we have a lot of influence from United States. So many people want to listen what is in US because also in Mexico we have rules and the politicians make the rules and they control all the media we have in Mexico. So I think that is one of the reasons because the students want to listen other things outside Mexico.
Okay.
So, yes.
I guess that's kind of like Australians. We gravitate, that would be gravitate to, the US news because it's big and it's celebrity and it's like, all the artists come from, America. So that's interesting that Mexico, I know obviously you're very close, to the country, but it's interesting that, the Mexican students gravitate towards that.
Well, we are just north of the border, but it's interesting to bring the politics into it because, when we look at it historically, mid-20th century, the newspapers tended to be Republican, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt, used radio, used the fireside chats. But then when you get to the Kennedy-Nixon debates and that, that longstanding idea that Kennedy did so much better on television, but people who just listened on radio thought that Nixon won the debate. But what sometimes is not mentioned is the fact that the audiences were not identical or equivalent, that the radio audience was more conservative And then with call-in radio, that's where you get the conservative politics and moving into the far-right politics, Rush Limbaugh and those folks who have really dominated the, kind of political call-in radio, which I remember my mother listening to, and I used to tell her, this is propaganda, Mom, don't, which she sort of understood, but she just still got a kick out of it because, people, kind of find that entertaining, nonetheless, but it's not that the medium, in terms of its content is completely neutral, but they tend to align with certain kinds of politics at different times. And maybe the more progressive folks are more inclined to use newer forms of technology, whereas the more conservative folks tend to stick with older forms. So I don't know. I'm just tossing that out there.
Well, it is interesting from living in Australia and watching the whole Donald Trump presidency unfold via Twitter, now X. It was incredible, and I write about this in my thesis and look at it as obviously, Donald Trump falling under a category of a celebrity, but he's also, we call him the business billionaire / president of the US. The way he had his message totally controlled and distributed it on Twitter or X, and just ran a political campaign on Twitter was just mind-blowing for us. And I think that definitely changed, as a politician, regardless of, whether it's Mexico or the US or Australia, how social media all of a sudden gave a celebrity or a social media influencer who was unknown the control over taking a message and distributing it to the world. And also, there's, there are some rules and regulations with social media, but nothing like traditional media in radio. Like, there is no way you could do what Donald Trump did on Twitter on, say, a radio station that we're sitting in right now. Not a chance. And I think, I'm not sure what your perspective is, obviously, from the US, the message that you get from that, or Laura from Mexico, like how you feel about that. Obviously not going too political into the Trump thing because we'll probably be here forever, but just how a president of a country, can go to a social media platform and run his campaign.
Well, think about it this way, right? There's no intermediary. You're speaking directly, or you're writing directly, typing directly to whoever your followers are. Now, what was really interesting about it was, well, who are his followers? How many followers? And then how many of them are bots and how many of them are real followers? And the numbers were inflated. But what happens is, because he's making these pronouncements, he's saying these outrageous things, the traditional media cover it. And they have to cover it. And then, well, how do they cover it? So I was a subscriber for many years to the New York Times. Again, Lance and I are from the New York metropolitan area. And, during the campaign and during the presidency, I sort of got disillusioned with the New York Times because they wouldn't say, oh, he lies. That's an outright lie. They wouldn't make that claim. They would just reprint what he said, contextualized to some extent. But the idea is, whatever he says, we have to cover it. In the newspaper, or the website of what was formerly a newspaper, on radio, on television, we have to cover him. And, there you go. That blows it up beyond proportion.
And of course, again, in general semantics, we talk about facts and what is a fact. And the way that, one of the ways around that is very often used in journalism is to report on a report. So as long as you're saying that, the politician said such and such, it doesn't matter whether such and such is a lie or a false claim or not, because the report that the person said that, assuming that the person did in fact say that, that is a true fact, and so you can, you can't be faulted for reporting on that factual basis. And I think, Thom, you're absolutely right that the number of people who are actually getting the message directly on Twitter was not that significant. But what was significant was the way that the news media, the traditional news media, were covering Twitter. And I think, perhaps from a progressive point of view, the one kind of positive thing about Elon Musk buying Twitter is the way he's destroyed it. I mean, I call it ex-Twitter now, but the fact that it's no longer something that has to absolutely be covered in the same way that it was prior to that.
When Donald Trump took over Twitter.
Right.
Yeah.
And now he's got his own platform. He's got his Trump Social, which is
Truth
the
Social,
parent company.
yeah.
Truth Social. Sorry. Yes. Sorry.
That's ironic.
And the stock is tanking right now, but he's got even fewer followers. And what's interesting about this too is his posts were his. There are other politicians prior to his candidacy, prior to that election. The Obama campaign, for instance, Obama is not typing on his BlackBerry these messages that he would post. He's got a staff of people that are doing it for, and young people who are the supposed experts in social media. But Trump, it was him, right? And you knew that it was him.
Yeah. And I think that's, that sort of brings up in my mind about Borstein and talking about the pseudo effect. And obviously, how, somebody can, like, obviously Donald Trump, he had control of the direct message that he was distributing, but someone like Obama had an entire team, which goes back to old media, where it's radio, television, and print, where you have a team of people who help you distribute a message and making sure it's, abides by the laws of Australia or the US or Mexico, and distributing it to audiences. And then going back to what Lance said about, journalism and the facts and how important that is. And I think for me, especially radio, the one thing I love about radio, especially in Australia, when you hear the news at the top of hour on a radio station, you know that journalist has to report the facts. And obviously that's debatable on that, but in alignment with the Australian law. And so that's why I love radio, and television has to do the same here. And whereas social media, not really, unless you're a publication like Channel 7 News, Channel 9, the Australian paper, the Australian Financial Review, or 90.9 CFM, the radio station here that we're working out of. And I think that's really important.
And you mentioned Daniel Borstein and the pseudo event, where there's the news report that isn't reporting on anything, and one of the points that Borstein makes about that is that for a report on something that actually happened, that's where we get into the sort of factual information, but for the pseudo event, it's what does it mean? So we have just the pseudo event that Trump said anything. Well, nothing actually happened. He just said something. But what does it mean? Did he mean it? Did he intend it? What kind of policy might result from that? It just results in all of this speculation because we don't know. And even more so when there's a news leak, so we don't even know what's going on. Is this accurate? Is this really happening? We don't know. So it's all about the ambiguity rather than the clear statement of facts, which is why, again, we need sort of general semantics to sort of instill in people the idea of, being able to check the facts. We were at a session with one of Renee's dissertation advisors at the International Communication Association, and it was a journalism group, papers talking about fact-checking, and I'd asked, well, do any of you have a definition of what a fact is? Because we do in general semantics, right? In general semantics, a fact is something that, based on the evidence that you have available to you can determine whether it's true or false. And none of them had a definition of fact that they were starting with. So how do you, in journalism, deal with the idea of fact-checking if you can't even say what a fact is?
And I loved when you asked that question, Lance, because obviously the room was filled with a plethora of people from around the globe. And I think it was really interesting because my professor who, is supervising me through my PhD had a very good point where she said that she was looking at the promise, not the fact. And I thought, is this going in a different way here? But just, you definitely gave them food for thought, and I'm sure they've gone away thinking about it. But yeah, it was really nice to see, obviously, I ICA 2024 as my first conference because obviously I've been doing my PhD candidature through COVID. So the only experiences I've had is thanks to Lance, obviously, where I've been presenting my research online. So it was really great to see Lance in full swing. I was like, oh, you could come to a press conference with me, Lance.
Well, and what you mentioned, the promise that that study was about, politicians make promises, and did they fulfill the promise or not? And, that is what we call an operational definition, that, we can operationalize that. We can look at the promise and based on the evidence available to us, did they cut taxes or not? Did they pass a law or not? Or did they try to pass the law? Did they do what they say they were going to do? Now that's clear cut. And so that was the only study in that group. And, I'm not trying to butter up your professors here.
Can you please do that, Professor Lance?
Well, I am, but it's the honest truth that they were the only ones who had an operational definition, and they just threw fact checking in there, I think, to be on the theme of the panel. But as they said, they weren't really dealing with the notion of fact. They were just dealing with the notion of promise, fulfilled or not fulfilled. You want to mention the name of your professor while we're...
Professor Lisa Waller. And you know what's really interesting that you bring that up, Lance, is because Lisa actually was a journalist before she moved into the world of academia. So, and working for some of, Australia's well-known publications. And I thought it was quite an interesting spin on the way that she did present that. When you come from a journalistic background like myself, who's worked in the industry and, you see the other side of it. It's like a different perspective, it's like, it's the lived experience that you get to see, and obviously when we do our research and we, interview research participants, or like my case, for example, I interviewed 20 celebrities that fell under a certain category of celebrity. The way that I share with them, do you understand that, in the world of academic literature, you fall under this category of celebrity? And they go, no, I'm not a celebrity. The Australians straight up go, not really. I don't want to own that identity. Whereas Jeff Stinko from Simple Plan, who's a Canadian in a Canadian rock band, Simple Plan, he identifies that really well and talks about different locations. So when Simple Plan comes to Mexico, they say that they need a body card because they are a celebrity. So it's really interesting the different countries of obviously, Lisa presented hers about promises, but she's a journalist. She's got that experience. When you talk to a celebrity, do you feel like that? Can I throw it all to you about, as academics and working, in academia, what's it like going from academia to like real life experiences? Is it something that you look for, search all the time, or how does that work for you?
I don't see a difference. I think that what I've tried to do in my career, and coming out of the background of media ecology and, working with Lance and our mentor, Neil Postman, what we're doing is trying to talk about things that are going on in the real world, not just to other academics, but, in the sense of what it means to be a public intellectual, whether we achieve that or not. And I think Lance, has done a really good job of bringing it to more than just, the people at an ICA conference. But, what we're really trying to do is to help and to make a difference. And so that's living and working in the real world.
What about you, Laura?
Yes, I think it's very important to be one person outside and inside the academia. And I teach some subjects about philosophy, ethics, anthropology. So it's very important for me to teach what is... the young people has to do, and to be also to follow that rules for me.
Yeah.
So yes, I think like Thom, it's very important to teach and to behave the same way outside the academia. Yeah.
And Lance, lucky Lance.
Of course, so much of what we do applies to the world beyond, and I particularly stress, I keep coming back to general semantics, but it is so important, when people make assumptions. I've had these dealings, particularly, people don't change. And of course they change, right? I mean, that is fundamental in general semantics, is not to assume permanence, but to understand the dynamic nature of things. But I did want to get back to this point, and we were talking about radio, and one of the distinctions of radio, while it's an electronic medium, just like television, is that radio, when it comes in, it's all about language. And so it's not that radical departure from print media at first, because we're still talking about language. It brings back orality, and in fact was a great boon for indigenous languages, so that the Celtic languages, Irish and the Gaelic languages have this big resurgence with radio, and other kinds of languages that were kind of being pushed out, and maybe many of them disappeared, but some of them at least were able to continue because radio gave them that kind of boost. But it is very much a language-oriented medium, apart from the music part of it, which often is in the form of songs, so you still get the linguistic content there. But I wanted to just bring up the point about language, because here we are in Australia, and presumably we speak the same language. Although some things struck me as different, and one of them, for example, is that here in Gold Coast there's a lot of seafood, and one of the things that we see listed are bugs.
Oh, you want to know about the bugs? Okay, so maybe just for a bit of fun, when you read bugs on the menu, like Laura, what do you think of? When you're reading a menu and go, oh, there's bugs. What kind of bugs do you think of?
Crickets.
Yes, I love that.
Actually, there's a big news item about cicadas, because this is like the big cicada year, and that people are talking about how to cook cicadas.
Yeah, it is.
Oh, they're delicious. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the National Communication Association in the United States is going to New Orleans for its upcoming conference in November. And in New Orleans, they have the tradition of what are called mud bugs. So I didn't find this alien in the way that Lance did, right? Mud bugs are crawfish, but that's what they call them.
Yes. Okay, so you'd like me to translate that for you?
Please.
When you read bugs on a menu in Australia, in Queensland, where we are in the state of Queensland, which is the southeast coast of Australia, just to reiterate that, on the beautiful Gold Coast, you have Moreton Bay bugs. Moreton Bay bugs are specifically for this region. They look similar to a lobster, but they're smaller and sweeter and gorgeous. And I prefer to have them, which we might try and see if we can have this experience together, fresh. And so you get them cut in half and you just put lemon on them and you can just straight in, and it's like so sweet and so beautiful. And it's Queensland. You can get it, obviously, Moreton Bay bugs across Australia, but Queensland is where you want to have them. So there are different kinds of bugs, obviously, but that's the one that you really want to. If you come to Australia, you want to go for the Moreton Bay bug.
So in other words, shellfish.
Shellfish.
And when I teach general semantics, and this is also a cultural kind of thing, but I bring up the fact that most people, including my students, the thought of eating bugs, eating insects, is not something they would entertain. I mean, it's not something I would entertain personally. And it's kind of makes you feel a little sick even, although we have, they used to do it on Survivor, eating all kinds of disgusting things, and just seeing it might make you feel sick. But then I point out that, well, what do you think a lobster is but a bug of the sea, right? It's an insect that lives in the ocean. A crab has 8 legs. It's a spider. Shrimp, these are all
which
really
is prawns in Australia. We call them prawns.
That's right.
But they're bugs. And, in terms of nutrition, there's no difference. They're all safe to eat. In the Bible, in I guess, Leviticus, there are grasshoppers are kosher. There are 4 species of grasshoppers that are considered kosher, which makes sense if you're living in the desert. And, people who are in the military and have survival training, they learn about what bugs are, okay to eat. So, but it is this kind of arbitrary categories that we put things into. And some cultures are more restricted. And you have kosher laws, halal laws, and other cultures are just wide open. We'll eat anything, like the Japanese will eat anything, right?
Sea urchin. Have you had sea urchin? I had that in Japan.
Yeah.
It was so beautiful.
Terrific. Yes, absolutely.
And it was funny. I'll quickly tell the story. Sorry to interrupt, Lance, but we can go back around to that. But I was lucky to go to Japan with one of my friends who is the manager and a tour manager of one of the biggest Japanese bands, and they all wear masks. And we went out with the record company, and they took us to the restaurant where Kill Bill was filmed, you know, the film with Uma Thurman. And we get there, and obviously the record company's paying for everything, and they're like, Renee, would you like to try some urchin? And I'm like, sea urchin? Yeah, totally, let's do it. And they were blown out that I actually tasted it and loved it, because obviously it's a delicacy there. Have you all been to Japan? Laura, have you been to Japan?
No, never.
Okay, so it's something, do you like shellfish, seafood?
I don't know.
Okay.
Shrimp.
Shrimp.
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay.
Yes.
Lobster.
Lobster. Okay, well, you'll experience. What about you, Tom? Have you had urchin?
Uni. Oh, absolutely.
Uni.
I love it. Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah.
Japanese. I love that. And Lance, obviously you haven't had it?
No.
Okay. That's like a definite no.
Well, we're talking about eating bugs and, going back to radio. Well, it's not really radio. MTV used to have a show that it didn't last very long, but they would go to college campuses and they would offer money to students to do all kinds of outlandish things. And they came to my former campus, and one of my students, for $250, they pulled out a centipede that was about this long. Ooh. Well, you can't see that on the podcast. It was about 8-10 inches long, and it was about half an inch thick, and it was alive. And for $250, he took a bite out of it and chewed it and swallowed it. And I was like, I would have, held out for a lot more money than $250.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, I mean, one of the ways that this was brought home for me, like long ago, I remember being with our Tom and I, my old professor, Christine Nystrom, and this was near where she lived. It was like around 18th Street on 3rd Avenue, and there was a seafood restaurant, and it was like a building, tall building, and on the side of the building was like, I don't know, a sculpture, like a giant lobster that was like affixed to the side of the building. And she pointed to it and she said, doesn't that look like a cockroach? Right? Because they would climb, they climb up the walls, when you have them infested especially in New York apartments. And of course it did, I mean, this was a very astute observation, but it brought home, the fact that these things are no different really essentially from bugs. But again, it's the arbitrary nature of our abstracting and our classification.
And I think that's like really interesting, talking about the language thing. Obviously growing up in Australia, as an Aussie, you can have a really ochre accent, which is in Queensland, which is north of Melbourne and Sydney. If you look on the map, we're a little, it's almost like, I guess, the Santa Monica sort of vibe, San Diego, and you can be a little bit more ochre as an Aussie, meaning your accent's a bit more twisted. And then when you go to Melbourne and Sydney, it's a little bit more like New York, and, accents and languages are different. But when I moved to Los Angeles, speaking of language and the translation of looking at a menu and going, what is a bug? I struggled. Like, I'd been traveling there for probably about 10 years on and off, and I'd go on the Vans Warped Tour and I'd work with all these artists. And then when I moved there to be the entertainment reporter for Australia, I found out very quickly that even though I speak English, my accent sometimes could not be understood. And it was a running joke. Even when I'd ring up about my phone bill or I'd order something on the phone, I would have to put an American twang on. Because no one would understand.
Can you do that right now?
Do you want the Valley Girl or do you want the New Yorker? See, I'm not. It's funny.
Do a bit of both. Let's hear it.
I don't know. What do you want me to say? I'm on the spot.
I'll tell you though, some of the programs like I've watched, I mean, it's over now, The Walking Dead.
Yes.
And they all have like these Southern accents. And then when they do the interviews with the actors and they have Australian accents. And I just find that mind blowing. I just can't wrap around how, I mean, we're used to, Americans doing like bad English accents, like Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins or whatever, or Australian accents or whatever. But hearing Australians and English folk doing American accents, it just find that disconcerting somehow.
Well, if you think about celebrity in the field that I'm researching in, and if you look at Margot Robbie, obviously the star of Barbie, Margot Robbie is from the Gold Coast. She's from here.
I'm sorry, say Barbie again?
Barbie. It sounds like we're having a Barbie. Like we say that instead of saying, oh, let's have a barbecue, we say, let's have a Barbie. You want to come around and throw some snags on the Barbie.
It was also Harley Quinn. That's,
Oh, really? Yeah.
Where she does that kind of, it is a kind of New York accent that she does.
And so she talks about language, and obviously Margot Robbie started out on a TV show here called Neighbours, and that's where she cut her teeth as an actor. And then, she moved to the US, and she engaged with obviously a dialect coach and a language, so she could get the accents going. And if you look at Wolf of Wall Street, when she's in the
Brooklyn
film
accent,
with Leonardo DiCaprio,
which is the same one that for Harley Quinn, basically.
Yeah. She worked on that so full on. But there's another, if I go back to, and you may remember this because this was shot in New York, there's an Australian actor called Anthony LaPaglia. And you know Anthony LaPaglia? Okay.
So, yeah.
So he was in like Law and Order, and what was the TV show similar to that? He was in a Cold Case or something like that.
NCIS?
NCIS?
I don't know.
One of those. He's done like quite a few amazing Australian films. And so I, had, been reading about his story, and he said that, he tried to crack the US market for 10 years. And so he would go start an audition in his Australian accent and then switch into the American, obviously, for the part. And then after that, he's like, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to change my language and be an American. And he got his first gig, and that was it. And his career took off.
Now, do you know what's interesting to go back to radio?
Yeah.
What's interesting about radio in the United States is there is a radio voice that is accentless, and it's almost as though everybody, wherever they are in the country, if you go to Texas, people will speak like I'm speaking, not with the twang that Lance was talking about before. Now, again, I'm not saying that I don't have an accent, although I remember giving a talk at Lance's university, at Fordham University, when his dean came up to me, and his dean had later became the president of the university. He said to me, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from here." And he said, "Really? You don't have an accent?" And I said, "Oh, my heart, thank you." Right. But again, in broadcasting, there is you get rid of idiom and dialect, and you get rid of accent and speak this just sort of prestige kind of way of talking.
Wow. I don't know how voice actors are going to feel about that, or radio presenters. And that also is leading into AI.
But now are you going to treat us to some of these voices?
American accents. Well, when I was doing my radio show, it was a top 40 show.
I guess you're not. You're afraid to.
I'm like nervous. Oh, what can I say? I don't even know. It's been so long since I've been to America. I have lost my accent. You know what I'm saying?
That's a little valley. That's good.
Yeah.
It's a bit valley.
America.
Yeah.
Even at my university at RMIT in Melbourne, it's a very multicultural campus. It's incredible. It's in the city. My grandfather actually used to work on campus doing something different. And I really love that about Australia. We're such a multicultural country. And, I'm so treated to, Americans doing their PhD there or their masters, or some of the professors that I collaborate with, some of them are from the UK. And it's just really interesting listening to all of us speak and the language that we use, and even just the pronunciation of certain words. Somebody from India might say it differently to an Australian. And then in our minds, we kind of think, did I say that the right way? Is that the right way? Am I doing the right thing? The pronunciation of names. So going back to language, and looking at the menu, Lance, and you're like, well, what's a bug? I mean, that was like one of the biggest things that I climatized in America living full time, just ordering off the menu, putting a twang on my accent, certain things from we're taking out the rubbish bin. Well, it's actually the trash can in America.
Right.
Those kind of things.
Or the garbage.
Yeah, taking out the garbage.
Garbage.
Or, for example, we're going to put fuel in the car. No, we're going to put gas in the car.
Not petrol.
Yeah. Petrol, yeah.
But here's one, going back to food, that really struck me is schnitzel.
Oh, yeah, that's schnitzel. Yeah.
I mean, and it's not an unknown, it wasn't unknown, and I think maybe more so growing up where there were occasionally German restaurants, but it was always peculiar to German food, that you would have Wiener Schnitzel, you know. But here it seems that instead of saying cutlet, they say schnitzel for what we would call a cutlet, if I get that right.
Yeah, but it also, have you had a parma? A parma is like a chicken parma.
Yeah.
So that's very Australian. But also we have lamb chops. Do you have lamb chops?
Yeah, we have lamb chops.
Yeah.
But the parma was sort of like, you know, we would have like a chicken parm or chicken parmesan, but it would have more, it was a little different, but it still had the idea of like a breaded cutlet, again, with cheese on it and some tomato sauce, not as much as we would have. You know, we're often swimming in it.
Totally.
But still, just schnitzel is everywhere. And it's like, what's going on? You know, did World War II not happen here, that you have all this German
Well, that I can't answer for you, but I can definitely.
It's just schnitzel.
It's just schnitzel. But, you know, I mean, I've been to Germany and had schnitzel, and I've been to Austria, but it brings me back to this point that I want to share. So one of my best friends, she's Texan, and she's a private flight attendant. And so how we connected was through one of my other friends when she actually came to Service Paradise. And so we've been friends for over 10 years, and we constantly talk about the different languages that, you know, obviously we speak English, but we laugh all the time. And I've got her up with the Australian slang, and she knows exactly, like, for example, if you say we're going to breakfast, we're going to have brekkie, you know. I also taught her how to make a poached egg. I mean, poached eggs in America or Mexico, is a poached egg like a thing, Laura, or having a poached egg?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's the same. Yes.
Yeah. Whereas in America, when I taught her how to make a poached egg, she's like, no, we have scrambled, or what do you have, over easy? See, there's another thing, the eggs.
Yeah.
Over easy. We don't call that here. I'm like, can you just flip the
sunny
egg?
side up?
Sunny side up. That we do.
Okay.
But yeah, it's interesting.
Well, since we're talking about language, and I think it's worth noting, especially since we are the official podcast of the Institute, that all four of us this afternoon will be at a session. We have a program session, and we've been doing a number of these at different conferences. We'll have a program session that's devoted to the new edition of the Ur text, the first major text, the first text on general semantics, which is, of course, Alfred Korzybski's Science and Sanity. We came out with the new edition just towards the end of last year. And we're very happy about that. And so we've been at all the different conferences that we're going to. We've been having program sessions discussing that. And in this particular one, we're pleased that Renée will be joining us for the discussion. Now, I know that this is all brand new for you, Renée, but so I don't want to put you under too much pressure, but I will put you under a little pressure. And what are your thoughts, based on what you've read in the book?
Well, thank you so much for having me on the panel. I am very honoured, considering I'm with all of you professionals. It's really interesting, this book. Obviously, the things that I gravitated towards, obviously, were my industry. So when, and I've obviously got a few quotes, because I said to Lance, what do I do here? What do you want me to do? So I just naturally went to the keywords that relate to me. So obviously radio, Hollywood film, and, obviously I read the book, and then I, was reading it the new school way. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. So instead of having a copy of the actual text in my hand, I read it, as an ebook. And I found there was such a different freedom, because I could go in and find the keywords very quickly and highlight them. But initially, obviously, when I went to that,
we just stop for a second and say that was, just in case that didn't come across clearly, ebook.
Ebook.
Right. Like on a Kindle, for those who are maybe didn't get that.
Oh, thank you for that. See, is that the Australian accent, or I'm just talking too fast as an Aussie?
I'm not sure. It may have been the accent.
I was fine. I had it.
I know, but I always think about, want to think about who's listening and make sure they got that clearly.
Absolutely. And you know what? That's a very good point, Lance, because when we're on radio, I always make sure that the language that we're expressing when we're live on radio is translated for audio medium, not television. And I think that's a real talent in these days, where radio stations are set up with cameras and podcasting. And when radio announces on air, describe something that's not suitable for an audio medium, the audience checks out. And so that's really important. So thank you for bringing that up. So obviously an ebook, which you can download via Apple, but that's how I read it. And going back to semantics, initially, when I think of semantics, I remember it takes me back to my childhood with my mum and dad. And that's where I first heard the word semantics, because my dad would say, "Are you trying to play semantics with me? What's happening?" You know, and my dad and I would have this great conversation and debate about semantics. And so initially, that's where I first, was introduced to the word semantics. In relation to obviously the book and the discussion we're going to have this afternoon, I think, for me, especially when it talks about, we talk about radio and television in the book, and it talks about how the introduction of semantics was already in TV and Hollywood films in the media industry, but the media industry and the people that work in it don't think about it on a different level like academics do. And I think I feel very lucky that I'm on this panel and being introduced to the literature via Lance, because it makes you think deeper about it. And I think that's what I connected to the most. Like, you can have the word semantic, but what does that mean for someone that works in radio and television and film? How does that translate to them, and how do they translate it to the audience in their field? Whereas if you look at Lance's work and the discussions in it's so different. It's so different. And I think that's the one thing I've learned about academia, is that you can have this conversation in life generally and talk about semantics and think about it just on, like, as in the book, there's the quote, the layman's term of semantics, and then you can go deeper. So that's where I am thinking about the word semantics and where it's sitting. And obviously, in the evolution of this edition, which is the 6th, looking at, I found very interesting, obviously, the preface or the preface. What do you say in America?
Preface.
Preface. What do you say in Mexico, Laura?
Preface.
Preface, and we say preface. There we go. If you have a look at the preface from 1958 versus what you wrote in 2023, the difference of the introduction of media ecology and the evolution of that. Does that answer your question? I feel like I'm being tested.
I mean, I'll just jump in and say one of the most important things about us having the IGS having put out the new edition is your preface or preface, which is really just a wonderful contextualization and updating of it was hard to say, previous prefaces. Right? Prefaces? Front
matter.
Front matter, yeah.
Front matter.
Yeah. It really is a really important contribution, what you wrote, Lance.
Well, I mean, it is just an add-on, though, and we over like 100 pages now of front matter added to it. Of course, we say that general semantics isn't semantics, that there are two kind of different things, and there's been a level of discomfort with the term semantics applied to this, but certainly, I mean, a lot of its origin goes back to Korzybski, writing this in radio days, in the days when people are affected by radio and responding to radio as if it were, Pavlov's dogs, in a way that, the visceral response to people's voices and to particular words that are setting them off and getting them emotionally driven. So propaganda was very much a part of the initial impetus and very much a concern today.
And radio comes along right after, at least in the United States, right after he wrote Manhood of Humanity.
Right.
And sort of kicks in exactly at the time that the first edition of Science and Sanity comes out, right? During the Great Depression, when radio survives, all these other businesses in the United States are collapsing and retrenching, and radio becomes this escape, and doesn't grow during that period, but exists for, important reasons. Yeah. And functions as a major news media,
Absolutely. Which is the key concern. Laura, what are your thoughts?
Well, I want to congratulate Renée, because I think it's very important to take these kind of concepts about semantics to your area. So
thank you.
to make this translation, it's very important, because we as academic people, maybe sometimes we cannot see that bridge or that obstacle, but it's wonderful that you can bring that things to us, and congratulations. Yes.
Thank you. I always get really nervous. I'm just going to be vulnerable and honest about this because obviously, academia, the world of academia, yes, I've, been doing my master's and my PhD for 6 years now. And, it's, I'm so honored to be included in this panel and also connect around the world. But I am nowhere near say, for example, my radio career of 20 years, the experience that I have, I can go and interview Tom Cruise tomorrow or Mark Wahlberg and just do that off the top of my head. And what I found really inspirational with the three of you is that you just talk as if it's just a natural part of your language and it just comes out of you, and it's this really wonderful, beautiful thing to watch, and also how it's connected people around the world, from different parts of the world, and how a piece of literature like this book with Lance, he said, have a look at it, what you think, and how I've looked at it more so from my media career and industry, which I gravitate towards in academia more so because I'm so experienced in that. And that's been probably my biggest challenge, I think, doing my PhD is how do I, unite my media career, my industry career, in alignment with academia and the literature that's been published, which is incredible. And one of my goals is, what you just said, Laura, is to unite the two. It's like, how can I explain this wonderful work that has been written and rewritten again, obviously the 6th edition of this book, and how can I explain that to somebody that's in radio or television and film? Because it's a very important message. And so that's, ask me in 10 years.
Absolutely. Your journey's just beginning with that. I will say with, the three of us, naturally gravitate towards the academic, but general semantics was, traditionally, while Korzybski drew on philosophy, science, mathematics, and all of these things, and engineering, and the book, the common response is that it took me like 3 or 4 times to get through the book. It's a very difficult book to work through. But that it was, the intent was to create something for regular folks, not something that was purely academic, but something that could be applied to any walk of life, any professional pursuit, any political aspect pursuit, and just everyday life, human relations in all its manifestations.
Not that everyday folk are going to pick up the tome and read it. It helps to have people who interpret it for you and help you learn what it's about. But it's interesting when you were talking about reading it. We make meaning, right? And we make meaning based upon the whole epistemic experiential set that we come from. It was Roland Barthes who said, the book sitting there by itself has no meaning. You make meaning of it when you open it and make sense of it and interpret it based upon your frame, right? And so, what else can we do, right?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Obviously, I'm thinking about, what you gravitate towards in any literature. It's like I automatically go, okay, what do I know? I know about the field of celebrity, and I'm definitely in depth learning about media ecology and social media influences, and obviously old media and new media. And I'm like, okay, let's just gravitate to what I can hang on to and talk about. And I think that's why, I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of you, because I feel like sometimes that, especially, in life in general, like you're not meant to know everything. And I think sometimes, great things happen, obviously, with the collaboration of this book and the 6th edition. It was a team created, right, Lance, to make this happen. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
I think it was kind of you, Lance.
Well,
everyone's names are in the book. I've seen you all.
It's a real time-binding effort, though, going back to the 1st edition. The map is not the territory. We can apply that to celebrity and say that the image is not the person, and and that's just a very very slight example of how we can apply general semantics to this sort of area. I did want to mention before we sign off here that I came a bit early to Australia and to Sydney and was able to meet and have a session with the Australian Society for General Semantics, which they posted on YouTube, and Renée, you were able to zoom into that session as well. So you have that connection now.
Yeah, which is amazing. And thank you so much for that. And that was such a wonderful presentation. I mean, Lance has been really busy since he's been in Australia. I mean, he's been presenting all of this work, but you also got to have a moment with a koala, which was wonderful.
Yes. And Laura, you got to do one yourself.
Yes, of course. And I want to congratulate you again because I love your culture, your country. Australia is beautiful. The people, you are very kind. So I love your country, your nature, your animals. And of course, I have my photo with the koala. It's beautiful. Yes.
Well, welcome and thank you so much for that, because us Aussies love to hear that. And we love having people from all around the world and come and visit, and especially the Gold Coast. It's quite, I guess, really a unique moment in your life to actually come to the Gold Coast. When people come to Australia, they either go to Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. So,
but this is Surfers Paradise?
Surfers Paradise.
Is this where the movie Endless Summer, is this where they ended up?
I thought that movie.
Bali.
Bali, yeah, that was Bali.
Oh, okay.
But some of the most famous films have been filmed here. So Elvis, directed by Baz Luhrmann, and they stayed in this area. Obviously, Chris Hemsworth has done a lot of films here. Nicole Kidman in Byron Bay, which is just down the road a bit. So yeah, quite a lot is happening here, and that's thankful. Obviously, the Australians like Russell Crowe, Nicole Kidman, Chris Hemsworth. Mel Gibson, who's technically a Kiwi, but that's New Zealander. But yeah, I mean, it's, and we're very thankful for, obviously America, especially where Hollywood, has made the Australian actors famous because, and that's what I love, and I have been to Mexico and I'd love to travel more of Mexico, but it's, we're so embraced when we go overseas. And, if you ask any Australian, we're so thankful for, what America as a country does for us Australians, because it actually puts us on the map, taking it back to what Lance was saying. We, as Australians, if we're in the entertainment industry, we go to Hollywood to make it. And if you make it, you've made it and you're on the map, and then you come home and Australia loves you and, you're Margot Robbie and then you're Hemsworth. And so, it's really important. So, so thank you for saying that. Tom, have you had a good time?
I've had a wonderful time. I mean, I got here just in time for the convention, so I haven't really had that much time. I don't have a picture of myself with a koala.
No, but you definitely had an Australian coffee espresso, which was...
I did. And I have a couple more days here after the conference has ended. And so, I'll go back down to Sydney for a little while and, have as much fun as I can once the work is done.
Amazing.
Well, this has just been a marvelous session. So much fun to do. And here at this radio station, I really want to express our deepest gratitude to Renée Peterson for hosting us here. Do you want to give us the call sign or the call off and sign us off for this episode?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Lance, Laura, and Tom. It is wonderful to have you in Australia, and also extend extra thanks to having me on the panel at ICA 2024. I look forward to seeing you in Mexico, Laura, and then obviously on the New Yorker side in the US with Lance and Tom. We are broadcasting live from 90.9 CFM. Here in Surfers Paradise on the Gold Coast in Australia. Goodbye, everyone.
You've been listening to our June 2024 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Renée Peterson in conversation with IGS trustees Lance Strate, Thom Gencarelli, and Laura Trujillo-Liñán. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics, if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 22nd episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. Until then, just remember this simple fact, that the map is not the territory.